Well, hello everybody and welcome to this launch event. Why do we need new research on internal displacement? The title of today's session sets the scene for us to launch a fantastic special issue of the Refugee Survey Quarterly, literally just published. The theme of this impressive new collection of innovative research is the urgent challenge of improving attention to internal displacement globally. Appropriately then, the special issue was guest edited by staff of the Secretariat of the UN Secretary-General's high-level panel on internal displacement, Greta Zeender and Mark Yarnell. And Mark will be moderating today's discussion. For those who don't know me, I'm Professor David Cantor, editor of the RSQ journal and director of the Internal Displacement Research Programme, the IDRP, at the University of London, which is the host for this launch event. Allow me to begin with some standard Zoom housekeeping reminders. Please do keep your microphones on mute and your videos off, unless you're a presenter or specifically invited to make an intervention by the moderator. We will be recording this session and the podcast should be available next week on our website. Let me also direct your attention to the chat function on Zoom, where bios for all of the speakers will shortly be posted. You can see the structure of today's event on your screens. In a couple of minutes, I'll start us off with some thoughts on the importance of researching internal displacement and the contribution made by the special issue in that regard. Then Mark Yarnell, the special issue guest editor and moderator, will explain the scope of new research in the special issue and how it relates to the work of the high-level panel on internal displacement. 3 RSQ special issue authors will then present some of the key findings on political will from their articles to open our discussion of why new research like this is just so crucial. After those presentations, Mark will open to the floor for broader discussion of the state of research in the internal displacement field. To round off our event, George Okoth-Obo and I will share some comments on the future direction of policy and on how the IDRP can support your research on internal displacement. But now, let's get back to some key questions for today's discussion. Why is there so little research on the topic of internal displacement? And why does that matter for academic debate and for practical action on IDPs? In other words, why do we need more new research on internal displacement? Our point of departure, if you like, in this discussion is the fact that research on internal displacement is quite scarce and fragmentary. Consider the number of authors publishing articles and books on internal displacement. They're surprisingly few, especially when compared to the enormous quantity of parallel research on refugees. Think how many academic centres work on refugees. By contrast, there's no academic research institution dedicated to internal displacement, although the IDRP is trying to fill that gap. In short, the relative paucity of academic interest in internal displacement is quite striking. As a result, recent reviews of the literature on IDPs identify a wide range of fundamental themes on which there really are significant gaps in our knowledge. In other words, the lack of research does not reflect the fact that we know this topic too well already, quite the contrary. So why does so little research exist on internal displacement? I'm very keen to hear what ideas come out of the presentations and discussion later in this session. But to spark off that discussion, I'd like to play devil's advocate and suggest a few deliberately polemical possibilities about why there is so little academic interest in the theme of internal displacement. In doing so, I'll continue to use refugee research as a point of comparison, because of all the parallel fields of research, this is the one that I know best. But perhaps similar observations may well hold elsewhere too. So why does so little research exist? Well, firstly, it may be relevant that over 99% of recent conflict-driven IDPs live in low or middle-income countries. My concern here is that just as powerful states in the global north are more directly affected by and thus interested in refugee flows than in internal displacement, so too a forced migration research agenda has emerged that is also dominated largely by an interest in refugees in the global north and their routes to the global north. It's perhaps telling, by contrast, that whereas global south scholars are a distinct minority in the published literature on refugees, their contribution to the recent published literature on IDPs is actually far more notable, particularly in the disciplines of law and the medical and health sciences. Put bluntly, might the relative lack of academic interest simply reflect the extent to which the interests of the global north dominate research agendas in the forced migration field? Secondly, and perhaps paradoxically in light of what I've just said, in some academic circles, the hesitancy to engage substantively with internal displacement seems to be based on fears that this might in some way play into the containment agenda of states in the global north. That agenda sees attention to the IDP issue as a way to undermine the institution of asylum by keeping potential refugees trapped in the global south as IDPs. That's certainly a laudable concern, but the reality of events in the past 20 years since it first emerged puts this concern into doubt. Self-evidently, states in the global north do not need to dissuade refugee arrivals by investing in IDP protection, when they can far more easily impose visas and travel bans to stop flights, use interception to stop boat arrivals, and impose procedural obstacles to stop those who do arrive from securing refugee status, as has been the case now for several years. The concern, I feel, thus lacks a clear basis in the contemporary reality of state action. Moreover, on this point, data from several countries suggest that IDPs and refugees who arrive in the global north have quite distinct profiles, social profiles. As a result, protecting IDPs is unlikely to dissuade movement by those who are more likely to come to the north as refugees anyway. Thirdly, is the research gap perhaps because internal displacement simply lacks any real impact in today's world? Clearly not. Even in just humanitarian or development terms, the internal displacement crisis clearly has far-reaching implications. Think about the scale of the issue. Even before you add in the many millions of disaster-driven IDPs, latest estimates point to 8.5 million new internal displacements due to conflict and violence in 2019, compared to 2.4 million new refugees. And this degree of magnitude is not just a flash in the pan. The general trend in IDP numbers over the past 15 years is certainly one of steady increase. Meanwhile, on the desperate situation of IDPs themselves, recent research reviews of published studies suggest that IDPs are not only highly vulnerable, but they also appear often to have worse outcomes than other residents of conflict-affected countries, including those who flee as refugees. This seems to be due to several conspiring factors. IDPs are mainly from poorer zones where conflict clusters. As such, they tend to have been directly exposed to violence, and they were often poor to start off with. Unlike those who stay put, though, they suffer major losses of home and property as a result of displacement, as well as ruptures to community and family support. They remain in countries devastated by conflict. As such, their economic, health, security, and living conditions are usually precarious. Aid per person to IDPs tends to be comparatively less than for refugees, even though many laws and policies now exist on IDPs, as they do for refugees. And finally, IDPs' increased poverty and poorer physical and mental health outcomes also appear to be long-lasting effects, even after the conflict ends. My point here is not to establish hierarchies of virtue between IDPs, refugees, and others, nor to suggest in any way that refugee issues are not important in their own right. Of course they are. It's simply to emphasize that at the level of individuals, households, and societies, internal displacement does produce humanitarian, development and social impacts of real significance. This is to say nothing of wider political questions around citizenship, culture, identity and so on that internal displacement also generates. In short, for both scholarship and policy, internal displacement presents a broad range of really live issues that merit being treated by researchers with the importance that they do truly possess. Much more new research is thus needed to properly investigate and understand them. Given that backdrop, and as RSQ editor, it only remains now for me to say how absolutely delighted I am to launch this special issue on internal displacement. It represents a major high point, both for the recent field of IDP research and for the RSQ, as a peer-reviewed journal publishing work at the cutting edge of research, policy and practice, and from a range of disciplinary perspectives. If you've read the special issue, then you already know that the 21 articles that it contains are wonderful, short, pithy pieces of research that extend to addressing 7 different policy-relevant themes, and also that this body of work brings together diverse new thinking by over 40 authors from all around the world. If you haven't yet had the opportunity to browse through these articles, then I really encourage you to do so. They're not only well worth the read, but they're also free to access online. Finally, I'd like to say many congratulations to all involved in putting together this special issue: guest editors, authors, and reviewers. It's a really significant achievement of which you should be justly proud, and it represents a substantive contribution to new research in the field of internal displacement. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction and for setting the scene for today's I think a discussion really looking forward to. It's an absolute pleasure to serve as moderator for this event, but it was a special honor and privilege to serve as a guest editor for the RSQ special issue along with my colleague Greta Zeender. As David indicated, I am Mark Yarnell. I'm the Research and Report Officer on the Secretariat of the High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, established the High-Level Panel in order to raise international attention to the issue of internal displacement. Its task is to prepare and present a report to the Secretary General with bold and practical recommendations on how to better respond to internal displacement, and in particular, to achieve government-led durable solutions. The panel began its work almost 1 year ago in February of 2020, and will submit its report to the Secretary General in September of this year. I can speak from experience. This is a challenging and complex endeavor. Indeed, despite some real progress over the past 2 decades since the guiding principles on internal displacement were established, the reality of the staggering numbers, the increasingly protracted and long-term nature of internal displacement around the world just shows that new thinking, bold ideas, creative ideas are absolutely needed to break through and make real progress on this issue. Business as usual cannot be accepted, not for the some 50 million people currently living in displacement, and not for those who face the real and present risk of being forced to flee from their homes as we speak. The RSQ special issue is particularly valuable not only because it draws a spotlight, as David said, on this global crisis that is often hidden in the shadows, but because the authors are addressing the very policy issues with which the members of the high-level panel are grappling with right now as they consider the recommendations to present to the Secretary General. It's been remarkably insightful for the work of the panel and the work of the Secretariat in supporting the panel. And in fact, we just finished a 3-hour meeting with the full panel and members of the executive or the expert advisory group that engaged on a number of these issues that are delved into in the RSQ special issue. And just looking again at the table of contents of the special issue of all the articles that are published, the topics that are covered are all directly relevant to the panel's deliberations, whether on political will, on the issue of how to really make sure there's adequate financing, on collaboration between humanitarian and development actors, on increasing significance of displacement and urbanization, on challenges relating to returns, on issues of how to really facilitate local integration for IDPs who can't return, promoting community resilience, human rights in the context of disasters. These are all, again, just could not be more relevant to these ongoing considerations as the panel carries out its work. One of those topics, the issue of how to galvanize and garner the political will of governments to actually prioritize internal displacement, hasn't taken center stage in the panel's work since day one. And so it's very appropriate that it is the feature of today's launch event. And I'm again absolutely looking forward to the discussion. Just before we get started, I want to thank Professor Cantor for initiating the idea of this special issue in the first place, and for inviting myself and my colleague Greta to serve as guest editors. I want to thank all those who submitted. I think we had close to 50 submissions for this publication. So thanks to all who submitted. Thank you to those who were part of the peer review process. And a special thank you to Susie Reardon-Smith at the University of London, who's helped with so much of the logistics and the preparation for this event. And just a quick point on logistics, following the presentation of the authors that is coming right up, if you'd like to make an intervention and brief remarks, no more than a minute or so, since we have quite a large group, I'll ask you to raise your hand. If you click on the participants box and then click on the logo to raise your hand, then I will happily call on you for to hear your remarks. If you'd like to ask a question though to the speakers, it may be easier if you write the question in the chat box, and then we can give the chance for the speakers to respond. So thanks again. Really looking forward to the discussion. Going to kick things off here. First, we're going to turn to Dr. Romola Adiola, who co-authored an article with Phil Orchard on a really important topic, looking at the fact that while there's been so much progress and evolution and development of the establishment of laws and policies around internal displacement at the national and regional level, there's a major gap in terms of the success of implementing those laws and policies in a concrete way. And that's exactly what her article gets at. And so I'll pass it over to Dr. Adiola, who is a fellow with the Center for Human Rights in the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And all the speaker bios are in the chat box, so I won't go into details, but they're all impressive. And I'll pass it over to Dr. Adiola for your presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Good day, everyone, and many thanks for the very kind invitation to this launch event of the RSQ special issue on internal displacement. And Mark, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. As mentioned by Mark, for the special issue, I co-authored an article with Phil Orchard from the University of Wollongong titled "The Role of Law and Policy in Fostering Responsibility and Accountability of Government Towards Internally Displaced Persons." And I'll just like to briefly highlight some of the key points from our article, and also zoom out into a broader discussion on the implication of this for research in the field of internal displacement going forward. And just to sort of give a significant insight, our article begins by looking at the law and policy terrain on internal displacement across various countries. And we start up with a reflection on the guiding principles, which Mark has emphasized earlier, and observed that since the emergence of the guiding principles in 1998, there has been a significant rise in laws and policies on internal displacement. At the continental level, for instance, we've seen the normative influence of the guiding principles in the formation of the protocol on the protection and assistance to internally displaced persons within the Great Lakes region in Africa. And also at the continental level, we've seen this with the adoption of the African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in Africa, also known as the Kampala Convention, which was adopted in 2009. At the national level, what we found from our research is that between 1992, around 1992 and 2020, we've seen that at least 43 countries have adopted laws and policies of internal displacement. But it's also important to emphasize that with the emergence of the guiding principles on internal displacement, we've seen a significant rise in that. And a significant majority of these laws, about 44 out of a total of 72 laws, and major policies, acknowledge the fact that IDPs are protected by international laws and also domestic constitutions. So just to emphasize that between 1992 and 2020, what we've seen is that in at least 43 countries, we've seen laws and policies on internal displacement. But then in terms of the actual laws and policies, about 44 out of a total of 72 acknowledge the fact that IDPs are protected by international and of course, domestic constitutions. But however, we observed that about 32 of these mention the guiding principles and about 21 endorse its definitions. And we also found that IDP definitions are limited in 3 ways. So to citizens in certain instances, specific regions or timeframes, such as making the norms applicable to persons who are displaced between specific time frames and context. And we also see limitations in terms of being specifically applicable to root causes such as climate change and disaster displacements. And this is important. However, what we observed is that in terms of actual situations in countries, it is important to have a holistic framework that is forward-looking and incorporates various root causes of internal displacement. It's not specific or limited to specific groups of persons within the state or to time frames, so that at least you can have a holistic law that sort of reflects on situations that are beyond, say, armed conflicts or just disasters in specific instances. And while we observed that some of these laws and policies actually focus on durable solutions, we did recognize an emphasis on return over other durable solutions. However, a significant positive change is the inclusion of IDPs in planning and decision-making processes, which is very important. Now, although we've seen a significant rise in these laws and policies, one pertinent challenge really remains implementation. And we've seen laws and policies remaining in draft stages in many countries for years. And in others, there may be adoption of the law and policy, but no further action. But then again, while implementation remains a challenge, there's some useful triggers, for instance, incentivizing political will that we gleaned from domestic context, where we've seen a level of implementation through law and policy formations. And our research sort of broadly identifies certain pertinent factors. And the first set of factors we recognize are contextual factors, such as timing, peace agreements, and linkages with other regional and international frameworks. And with respect to timing, we observed that a number of laws and policies were sort of introduced within 2 years of initial onset of internal displacement. And this is sometimes also coupled with the extent of attention and coverage that is given to IDP situations within the country. But there is also a sort of a need we recognize to sustain this attention specifically for more concrete actions, particularly in countries where there still draft laws and policies. And perhaps the initial response that characterized the introduction of these draft laws and policies at domestic level may have sort of waned over time. And in relation to peace agreements, we've seen some countries in implementation, we've seen some successes rather in implementation following from these processes. So we've seen that in countries such as, we've seen it in Liberia, we've seen it in Sierra Leone, Angola, but this is rather complex also because what we see as evident success of these are sometimes large scale supported and spontaneous returns. However, beyond this, we really don't see as much long-term commitment towards making solutions durable, given the situation on the ground. And the fact that, beyond stopgaps, there's a need for more sustained action in the protection of IDPs. And we also observed that independent actors can also play a significant role in fostering political will. And this could be from civil society, such as in Georgia and Philippines, could be courts in the case of Colombia. We also see non-entrepreneurs in the Nigerian case, for instance, and there are also transnational networks of civil society that may be useful in order to build this. As with National Human Rights Commission, we also feel very strongly that it's important to sort of ensure that we look at these commissions as a place for action, given the fact that they have within these commissions, we've often seen actions towards protection, human rights protection of various categories of persons, including IDPs, but not as much attention often sort of stays on these commissions in the furtherance of such protection. And also we further argue that international support can be integral to this process. And we do see great work being undertaken by several international regional actors. But what we tend to observe is that these responses are sort of relatively ad hoc in a sense. And we argue that a permanent technical team within the UN, for instance, should be set up for the furtherance of international support, and there are a range of options in terms of what such team should look like. And we've identified about 3 in our article. But very importantly, through this research, I think Phil and I really did seek to open up the conversation around factors that help shape political will, and as emphasized earlier by Mark, towards the implementation of laws and policies on internal displacement. But there's yet still, and this is something we find very as a significant gap, there is limited research on how to build political will. And for broader research, that we really think there's a need to really dig deep into these at the national level through country-specific studies. Also, there's a need for what I really like to call an understanding of trigger intersections observable from our study. For instance, the fact that more than one trigger may play a role, may be at play rather for a more sustained action. So for instance, peace agreements could lead to the development of norms, some successes in implementation in the context of conflict, but for a more sustained holistic action towards protection and assistance of IDPs, there may be a need for sustained international support, understanding how this, and really just sort of knowing how this triggers foster action and what works at what stage will be useful to inform actor-oriented approaches at various governance levels, including by international actors. And to commence this process, we really did find that, this is where we really now see the pertinence of having research networks within this context. And this is where research networks, for instance, such as the Internal Displacement Research Programme led by David Cantor, and the regional networks, such as the Global Engagement Network on Internal Displacement in Africa, GENIDA for short, which I did along with David, really comes in. For some of us who may not really be quite aware of what GENIDA is about, it's an international collaboration between on internal displacement, and it seeks to respond to the paucity of research on the subject within Africa, while also building capacity for policymakers. But of course, we do have sister networks in Latin America led by Dr. Beatriz Sanchez, and Middle East led by Dr. Hannah Asfor. But then evidently these research networks are important in order to sort of build a much more sustained and systemic research within the context of internal displacement. And ever so often we do see relevant policy informative research coming up, but then these are often in silos, and something we sort of observed very strongly. And one of the interesting facts about, for instance, my collaboration with Phil on this paper is that we both come from two different yet related disciplines, so law and political science. And an evident benefit of this research collaboration is that sort of shows the patterns of understanding internal displacement from an interdisciplinary dimension, but also how interdisciplinarity in the field can really provide a useful optics for further discussions in this context. And noting that my time is nearly up, thank you very, very kind attention, and I look forward to further discussions and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adiola, again, and I urge everyone to read the article that was co-authored with Phil Orchard. Again, it just points to very concrete factors that can translate laws and policies into actual implementation, which will then make a difference for people on the ground in reality. And so thank you for your contribution on that, and it's very relevant to the work that we're doing at the moment. So I'll hand it over right now to Dr. Ben Hudson, who is at the University of Exeter, and another really valuable contribution related to the issue of political will and looking at, there's no home at the moment for consistent, regular state-to-state dialogue on the issue of internal displacement. There's different ad hoc processes, there's different regional initiatives, but really appreciated this look at where there's current opportunities for that state-to-state dialogue to happen, and maybe what something new that should be looked into. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Hudson and look forward to the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm just attempting to share my screen. Mark, would you mind confirming that you can see my screen okay?
Yep, all good.
Perfect. Okay, fantastic. So Hello everyone, it's an honour to be here today amongst such illustrious company. I wish to start by thanking Professor Cantor and the high-level panel for inviting me to briefly speak on a paper that I had the pleasure of writing with my colleague and good friend, Dr. Brijana Harana. For this paper, the high-level panel tasked us with examining the topic of peer-to-peer dialogue on internal displacement. Specifically, we were asked to consider what role international platforms play in facilitating such interstate exchange, or to frame the question another way, we were interested in how the governments of countries affected by internal displacement do, and importantly can, engage in such peer-to-peer learning at the international level. We began therefore with a mapping and an appraisal of some existing platforms or fora, and these were broadly categorized into three: international human rights platforms, refugee platforms, and nascent internal displacement platforms. In respect to the human rights platforms, our attention was focused on the UN Universal Periodic Review, in particular how and in what ways internal displacement is raised during the review process. A comprehensive review of the UPR documentation reveals that engagement with internal displacement and IDP issues during the UPR process is limited, even in respect to those states that are home to the greatest number of IDPs. It's also limited as its scope of inquiry is predominantly framed around conflict-induced displacement only. There's no systematic way in which internal displacement is raised during the UPR process, and when it is, it can be resisted by states in what is a very public arena. Turning to the refugee platforms, for several decades, the UNHCR has of course been involved in IDP response. One way to feed into the UNHCR's policy vis-a-vis IDPs is through its executive committee, or EXCOM, which is composed of states. However, EXCOM's mandate is principally and understandably focused on refugee rather than IDP response, and thus its efforts in respect to IDPs again relate primarily to conflict-induced displacement. In respect to the Global Compact, although this has been criticised for virtually ignoring IDPs, one of its key objectives is to support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity. As such, IDP response should be a key consideration when implementing the compact, and there are numerous ways in which IDP issues can be raised within the GCR framework. For example, first at the global level, there's the Global Refugee Forum, which takes place every 4 years. It's a very broad, high-level platform where awareness of IDP issues, insofar as they relate to refugee issues, can be raised. However, IDP issues were not widely discussed at the 2019 GRF. Secondly, at the regional level, the Comprehensive Regional Protection and Solutions Framework in Central America and Mexico is a regional comprehensive refugee response framework of the kind promoted by the Global Compact. It provides a forum for the articulation of strategic actions and new initiatives to address forced displacement and international protection needs from a regional and human rights approach. Its rotating presidency holds multi-stakeholder dialogues, which includes member countries, on issues related to emergencies and current challenges in the search for comprehensive solutions. A working group on IDPs has been established, which at the time of when we were writing the paper was to convene 3 workshops on IDP matters. And finally, the paper explores 2 recent internal displacement specific initiatives, the GP20 and the Displacement Dialogues, the latter of which is hosted by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre and the International Organisation of Migration. In respect to the GP20, although not explicitly mandated to hold such peer-to-peer dialogues, it has nonetheless been catalytic in this respect, both in respect to its steering group meetings and its regional state-to-state exchanges. Both are open fora that have, whether through intentional design or not, provided a space that some states have utilised to discuss and exchange experiences on internal displacement. In contrast to the GP20 process, the displacement dialogues are closed events conducted under Chatham House rules. These are specifically intended to bring together ambassadorial level Geneva-based state representatives to openly, albeit not publicly, discuss, to share information, and to share best practice. So what does this tell us? What do these findings, what are the implications of these findings? Well, the first thing it tells us is that there is an appetite for peer-to-peer dialogue on internal displacement. It would be erroneous to look solely at, for example, the UPR and focus on its limitations and conclude from that that there is no such appetite. Engagement with the G20 process and the displacement dialogues reveals a willingness on the part of states to meet, to exchange, and to create partnerships, some of which may be unexpected. But we cannot expect such dialogue to spontaneously appear, and we cannot assume it to be easy. Moreover, it is clear that existing international fora suffer from underlying deficiencies in their design when viewed through the lens of internal displacement, and a simple copy-paste of refugee fora is unlikely to result in success. Such dialogue needs cultivating, and to do so demands getting forum design, process, and leadership right. This requires, for instance, simultaneous attention being given to the international and to the regional. A multi-layered approach would be preferable to a simplistic one-size-fits-all approach. So in summary, it is now finally time for a dedicated forum on internal displacement. It is true that every displacement crisis is in some way unique and that every IDP story, of course, differs. But states nonetheless have much to share and to learn from one another, both good and bad. And the momentum, the political will that we have seen through this research needs to be maintained and heightened before it itself wanes. How we successfully do this remains a question to be answered. So it's thus vital that research on internal displacement, research on political will, and peer-to-peer dialogue continues. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks so much, Dr. Hudson. Really useful to hear your ideas presented in that clear way. And again, urge everyone to read the article if they haven't. And I think as we move into the discussion after our next speaker, it would be interesting to hear if you or others have ideas about what form that might take and kind of what kind of parameters, and given as you mentioned, there's specific regional contextual issues that make each situation unique, but there's also cross-cutting international opportunities. So thanks again for your presentation, and we'll rejoin you in the discussion. So just finally, on the presentation side, we're going to turn now to Legia de Aquina Barbosa Magalhães with the Mexican Commission for the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights. Again, really valuable contribution looking at the role of civil society in garnering political will in terms of bringing the issue of IDPs to the attention of governments, holding their feet to the fire, bringing strategic litigation forward, and really making sure that governments not only establish laws, but again, relating to the first presentation, that they actually implement them. So I'll pass it over to Mrs. Magalhães. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark. Good day, everyone. It is a real pleasure and honor to be here today participating in this launch event. And I have many reasons to be thankful and to thank and congratulate the organization of this event, the previous presentations, but I also have limited time and a lot of things to talk about, and I tend to speak a lot. So I thought I would go straight to the point and introduce our research topic, but really, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it is really valuable. I wanted to mention though that yesterday when I was supposed to be preparing my presentation, I started reading other articles and I couldn't stop, and it made it very difficult for me to be able to prepare, but I hope I can do a good job because I'm also representing some very dear co-authors. So the article I am presenting today is a very collaborative effort about the role civil society organizations can play in incentivizing the political will of national governments to respond to internal displacement. And specifically, we focus on the importance of gathering data and building an evidence base, and how this works as a first step and the basis for all the other efforts, achievements, and outcomes that ultimately can lead to the recognition and response to internal displacement. And this, as I will talk about a little bit later, is also one of the key findings of this article. The article presents two study cases from two different civil society organizations working in El Salvador and in Mexico, and how these organizations had an important role on the recognition of internal displacement in these countries that had a specific context that I'll try to briefly introduce in a while, and also the response to internal displacement that is now being developed and is starting to happen in these countries. For the case of El Salvador, we look at the work of Cristosal. It's Noah Bullock and Maria Jose Solano Granados are co-authors in this article, and they work in Cristosal, which is a civil society organization that has been working and promoting human rights in El Salvador for more than 20 years, and more recently also more broadly in Central America. They are dedicated to several human rights issues, but also, at least for the past 5 years, they have dedicated specific efforts to the issue of internal displacement. And in Mexico, we look at the work of the Mexican Commission for the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights, which is where I work as a researcher, and also Brenda Perez Vasquez, which is the director of the Internal Displacement Department, because we are also a more broad organization. We also work with various human rights issues, but we have a dedicated department to the issue of internal displacement. And Brenda Perez is the director of this department, and she's also a co-author on this study. These are the two study cases, the two organizations we're looking at, and we were all brought together by Andres Liscano Rodriguez from GIPS, who has worked in supporting data and collaborative efforts in both countries and had this idea of looking at these experiences with this approach, talking about political will, because working on the field, we tend to look at it more specifically to the context. So we know this happened because of this and this actor and this institution. So this opportunity, that working on this article gave us the opportunity to look at it, to identify patterns, to compare both experiences, because we were familiar with the work of Cristosal, and it is a very inspiring, but working more specifically and trying to identify what were the common factors was really interesting, and allowed us to be able to hopefully inspire also and identify some good practices that could also be useful for other contexts, and hopefully inspire more research and practice around the world. So firstly, I would like to make some important remarks. As we have seen since the introduction and the previous presentations, there are many factors, contextual factors that can, and different stakeholders and actors that can play an important role on fostering political will on the part of the states. But specifically in this case of this article, we are looking at civil society organizations, and there are, we were able to identify some contextual factors that were present in both cases. Also, I wanted to specify that when we talk about political will, it could mean a lot of things, but because of the stage we are in these cases, and both of these countries that were actually regarding timing, were in a very similar place when these organizations starting to work directly with internal displacement in these countries. So when we talk about political will, or the response and how we are fostering this response, we look at two things: the recognition of internal displacement as something that exists in these countries, because in both countries there was a background of denial. And also we talk about the commitment to support a response, specifically through the development of a legal and policy framework. So the two study cases, they start by setting the scene in the countries. And as I said, we identified two main aspects. There was no recognition of internal displacement, and there was no specialized information on the issue. And how, well, as I said, both organizations, they were already working. I said Cristosal has been working for more than 20 years. The organization I work in has been working for more than 30 years, and with different human rights issues. And we started seeing cases of internal displacement. We started to get in touch with internally displaced persons. And when we tried to talk about these issues and to find some sort of attention to these victims, the response we would get from the state at is that it was not a real issue, because sometimes just omission, sometimes explicit denial by saying, no, there is no internal displacement in this country. So we realized we would have to prove the existence of the phenomenon. So that's one of the key findings, and I was talking about, because the first step was establishing and building an evidence base, because the first thing we had to do for the government to respond to internal displacement was proving that it was a real thing that existed in these countries in this context. So this was the first step, but I think an important aspect of it is that we started building this evidence, documenting cases, but an important thing was, even though we were doing something that the state was supposed to be doing, we always highlighted that actually it is the primary responsibility of the state. So even though both organizations produced information, reports, case documentations, registries, estimates of the amount of IDPs in both countries, we always highlighting, we needed to prove that this was there, that this existed, but always highlighting the responsibility of the state. So besides being able to prove that internal displacement exists through this comprehensive and extensive documentation, it also gave us in-depth understanding of the issue, and this puts us in a kind of a privileged position, because we were able to engage with different actors both at the national and international levels, and we also became nationally a reference point for government officials that heard about the issue and wanted to know more, or media, and we got some spaces to introduce the theme and the public debate, for example. Also, the position that NGOs and civil society organizations is also privileged, because by working with human rights victims of human rights violations and directly with IDPs, we can build a trust relationship in these contexts where it's a lot of corruption, mistrust in the national authorities. Many times victims are not willing or don't feel comfortable sharing information with government officials or authorities, and we have this privilege and this special position to build a trust relationship and then be able to document these cases. And this is also very valuable, because looking at the experience of these people with different institutions and how the response they got, we were able to see specific aspects, and this is very valuable to inform policy and see where the obstacles are, why they aren't able to get, for example, access to health services because they don't have this specific document and because they have to go through this process. So it was also very important to inform policy and gave us a lot of knowledge when we were finally able to do that. Also, documenting cases was very important, because both organizations, we legally represent cases. And so this documentation also helped us to build strong cases, because until now I was talking about how we were more indirectly fostering political response by creating information, putting pressure on the states, making this an issue, but also we were able to influence this in a more direct way, because both organizations legally represent cases. So we took, basically we took these cases to court, and by strategic litigation, we were able to have some outcomes that not only made a difference in these cases, but also created legal obligations for both the legislative and executive branches of the government to have to do something.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just going to give you the 1 minute warning, just because so we have enough time for discussion, but thanks so much.
Thank you. Just so to close, so this was also through strategic litigation, we were able to influence things more directly. Just to close, I wanted to mention two things. The introduction of the term internal displacement is really important, because first, when we wanted to document it, for example, through media monitoring, we had to look for people flee, abandoning houses. And now when we talk when we use the term internal displacement, we are able to create a common understanding. And there are countries, for example, I'm in Brazil right now, I'm Brazilian, and I know internal displacement happens here, but it's really difficult to find, people don't look at it through this lens. And to close, in both countries, you can see in the article, we had this recognition, and the response is starting, and the challenge is to see how, one, this learning that civil society organizations were able to gather, how we can keep having an influence and participating in the process, because now we have the challenge of implementation and designing the legal and policy framework, and how we can still participate in some sort of way, and also to make sure that the implementation follows international guidelines, that there are enough resources. So this is the challenge and the next steps, to see how the learning we have until now, we were able to create this political will and this momentum, and now the challenge is to keep it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think the invaluable role of civil society can't be overstated. So thank you for your contribution, to you and your co-authors. It was great to see all the collaboration on that piece, and the article that was just presented, as well as the articles of the other two, our two presenters, are in the chat box. So I urge you to check those out if you haven't seen them already. And now we'll open it up to discussion. So if you'd like to make an intervention, just please use the icon to raise your hand, and then we'll call on you. If you'd like to ask a question to one of the presenters, then easiest to write that into the chat box. So let's see if there's anyone who wants to initiate. Otherwise, I'll happily ask some questions. Is it Sudha Rajput? Are you interested to make a intervention?
Absolutely. So I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm Sudha Rajput. I'm a professor of refugee and migrant crisis at the George Washington University. I have been researching the issue of internal displacement for about 12 years now. My base case was Kashmir, the Kashmiri Pandits. And so my focus has been on the conflict-induced displacement. So what my research reveals, I have been researching a number of internal displacement issues, and my book is entitled Internal Displacement, the Comparative Case. So what I find, the issue with the research, the scarcity of research, it has to do with the framing of the issue of internal displacement. The way the issue is framed by the policymakers. For example, whenever I go and interview the policymakers about the existing internal displacement in their country, no policymaker, of course, would like to admit that something like that has happened under their watch. So they usually dismiss the issue by saying it was migrants. It's not really displacement, internal displacement. So I think the first thing we have to do in the academic community is to figure out how to get the policymakers to reframe the issue of internal displacement correctly. And until that happens, we do not have access to the policymakers and also to the research. So because no policymakers would like to admit the issue of internal displacement, and therefore the researchers also don't have access to the data that is available in their country. So that is one of the issues. So I just wanted to bring this aspect of my experience of researching internal displacement.
Thanks very much. I don't know, Professor Cantor, David, if you'd like to make any comment on that. I put you on the spot there.
Thank you. Yeah. So, well, thanks very much, Mark. Yeah, I've had the opportunity to make quite a lengthy intervention already. So just to say thank you very much to Sudha for putting that in. And I'd certainly encourage others who want to reflect on this issue of why we don't see so much research done on internal displacement, or why we don't see nearly enough research done on the issue? What might be the reasons for that, and ways in which we might think more constructively about building a research community of the kind of incipient one that we can see expressed through this special issue? So I'd prefer to leave it open to other questions and comments. I'm very happy to come back at the very end, of course, if that's desirable.
Thanks so much. Dr. Hudson, pass it over to you. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for your inputs to that. I think it's a really good point. It's a really worthwhile point. It's in some ways indicative of the fact that internal displacement has always been and probably will always be highly politicized, and that it is that individuals, human beings, are being used to meet state aims. You were talking of one example where states, where policymakers may not be keen to recognise internal displacement. My sort of base study was in Georgia, where Georgia do openly talk about internal displacement. They do discuss it. There has been obviously a very, very important case in the European Court of Human Rights, which was published today, which has important implications for internal displacement in Georgia as well. So I think that part of it is the politicization, which I think is what you were saying. And also, just to echo something that Professor Kanter said towards the beginning, I think that there is, on the part of the academic community, a need to provide more teaching to students at a younger level on internal displacement. As David mentioned, there is very little in terms of any sort of dedicated institute on internal displacement. And the same goes with teaching. I mean, it's something that I'm definitely thinking about now, how to effectively teach internal displacement as a topic to our interested undergraduates and others, as well as raising that knowledge level and that awareness amongst policymakers as well.
Thanks so much. That's very, very interesting. There's quite a relevant question in the chat box from Sarah Ruckman. I'm not sure I pronounced your name correctly, but it's a question of related to Turkey, but applies more generally, is why are governments not held at the same level of accountability with regard to IDPs than if they break agreements with regard to refugees? Isn't it possible to technically view IDPs as refugees in their own country? Maybe Dr. Adiola, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on this, but it's I think quite a relevant question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sarah, for that pertinent question. And I'll just probably think of it as and just sort of thinking about it now, that very important question. I think when we speak of IDPs, IDP protection, we're mostly speaking of those displaced within state borders, and there's a level of politicization of it in terms of how states relate with the issue of internal displacement that also affects accountability to a large extent. And you see this concern emerging, for instance, in pertinent issues such as say discussion of data, and even just in terms of basic descriptions about who belongs and who do not. And some countries will tell you, well, we don't have IDPs, and perhaps, in some other instances, it has, this might be due to the level of knowledge on internal displacement within the context of, the country's understanding of, forced migration, and, probably understanding refugees more than who IDPs are, and saying, oh, well, we don't have internally displaced persons, when perhaps they're persons that have been displaced due to disasters or even development projects, and not necessarily armed conflict. So really that conflation of IDPs or of internal displacement with just being one that occurs in terms of conflict situations, but not one that occurs in other situations and circumstances that we often see in other countries. But really, I think when we think about accountability and why perhaps there is not that level of accountability as such, I suppose it also it goes back to the question around, national level structures in fostering accountability and the extent to which they are effective. And this is where, you often see the problem, because, in IDPs are specifically, in terms of national primary responsibility, it's with the state of displacement. And, when national level structures are not as effective in terms of protecting and assisting these persons, then, it's quite difficult then to ensure, adequate protection for these persons. But then I think it's also important to sort of say that I wouldn't really call them, internal refugees. I would rather say that, we need to separate these issues. Of course, there are certain similarities we could see within IDPs and refugees, not least, for instance, in terms of initial movement patterns, or even in terms of, conversations around, durable solutions. So in certain instances, but there are specific differences. And I think that also shows us the importance of really reflecting on these very critically. But then also, I think a question around accountability is also important to investigate and interrogate quite strongly within the academic, research field, and hopefully you take this forward. But then also, I think this is also something that the high-level panel, very importantly, is doing quite strongly in terms of its engagement with states and other relevant actors. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Adiola. And maybe I'll just turn to Ligia, just on this issue of essentially it's the issue of governments assuming responsibility for their own citizens and residents, and would be interested to hear the paper that you and your colleagues and your co-authors wrote really highlights the role that civil society and human rights organizations play in holding governments accountable. But I guess just the question I have is in terms of what you'd like to see from a recommendation of the high-level panel, for instance, beyond saying there should be strong civil society, there should be strong human rights organizations, what do you think is needed in terms of more kind of ensuring that kind of more systematic and sustained engagement of local civil society? Thanks so much.
Thank you for the question. I think one important thing is participation, because one thing that sometimes worries us from civil society in engaging with government and participating, because we have a very strong responsibility. I'm speaking more thinking about the case in Mexico, which is where I work. We are the only organization working at a national level specifically with internal displacement. So for example, right now there is a law that is waiting to be discussed in the Senate, and one thing that we are asking for is an open parliament exercise, so people, not only us, but different civil society organizations, and more importantly, internally displaced persons can participate and discuss this law that is probably going to be approved soon. And because there have been some initiatives and some efforts, but they are not really effective. They don't really provide real opportunities for people to participate. There's not a lot of transparency. So when we take part on these exercises, then the government will use this maybe to build legitimacy and say, oh, now civil society is with us, so now this is good because they said so. So we really need to have, and it's hard because we don't really know how. We are always asking for participation and to be represented and for internally displaced persons to be heard. But I think we need to be able to visualize and to know how would that work in practice. How could the participation could be effective? And also, I think building capacity, because it's for us, for example, we're a very small team in this organization. There's not a lot of resources or capacity around with technical aspects. So building capacity in civil society would help a lot. There are a lot. I said we're the only organization working with internal displacement at a national level. At the local level, and because internal displacement in Mexico is very dispersed in the territory, so there are a lot of organizations working on the field, but and giving direct assistance sometimes to IDPs, but they don't have this resources, capacities, and also they aren't able to frequent the same spaces as we do. So I think representation and mechanisms to be able so they can directly participate are a very important issue.
Thanks very much for that. And just turning to another question in the chat box, most relevant for, I think, Dr. Adiola, is just a question on is it new laws that are needed, or is it just simply implementing existing protection frameworks and accountabilities, which is exactly, I think, a core issue that your article speaks to. So thanks.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very important question, and I think it's both, really. I say both because I think new laws, laws are required in countries that don't have laws on internal displacement. And the essence of law, really, in the context, in the discussion on internal displacement, sort of comes up from the place of having a form of guidance at the national level, but then really having some, a framework for fostering accountability, as we say, of government in the furtherance of protection and assistance of IDPs. And in countries where we don't see laws, one of the concern really also that emerges relates to institutional protection or, coordination of IDP issues. And we've seen that in a plethora of countries where you're not sure which institution really has what responsibility, but then having a specific law on that then creates a basis for understanding, how coordination should proceed at the national level. But then there's also the fact that, when we talk about root causes of internal displacement. Of course, we're quite familiar, with armed conflict situations, but then there are situations like development projects, there are situations like disasters. Emerging now, say, for instance, within the African context, and recognizing that the Kampala Convention is the issue of harmful practice and how that sort of relates to internal displacement. So you see root causes that are important to really begin to think through and think through how protection and assistance should be advanced, but then without a specific law that sort of talks about them or really brings them to the fore, that conversation can be missed. And then there's also the fact that you also need the law and policy in order to also bring together or create synergies between existing norms and policies. So for instance, you see that there are certain norms on human rights protection, there are norms on disaster displacement, there are norms on, say, resettlement of persons in the context of extractive industries, protection linked to development projects. But then all these norms at the national level are sometimes in silos, so they do not speak to each other. But then having a specific law on internal displacement sort of brings all that together. And also sort of helps in terms of how states, institutions, whether the courts, the executive or, or other role players, and even international actors can also sort of begin to think through protection and assistance much more systemically. So I'd say it's both. But of course, implementation is important, because if you have a law that is not being implemented, then it's as good as no law at all. So I think both are very important. Thank you very much, Mark.
A crucial point. Thanks so much. I see that my former boss, Andrea Lari at Refugees International, has raised his hand, so I would do well to call on him. So Andrea, welcome to the chat.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'll try to actually share a brief comment, and perhaps the speakers can react to that. So the question is accountability in civil society. Maybe this issue came out already. I had in and out attendance of the discussion, but I wanted to bring the case of Colombia, where civil society organizations help individual internally displaced people to file petition with the National Constitutional Commission, to an extent that more than 30,000 petitions were received. And at that point, the Constitutional Court could not ignore it anymore, and ruled that the government was in a state of inconstitutionality. The government was going against the Constitution, very progressive Constitution, and therefore had to rectify the situation in terms of assistance and protection of IDPs. It had to create a specific agency. It had to apportion significant resources, both on national and local level, to the point that when the government officials of this agency were not performing, could face arrest and criminal charges. So I don't know if the speakers can comment about this. Any other examples they came across in their research? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrea, and good to hear your voice. Ligia, are you interested to respond? Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, the case of Colombia, I think, is a very big inspiration and came before, specifically in Latin America, and we mention it not as extensively as we would like, but we mention it in the article. But talking about different examples, something very similar happened in El Salvador. The Constitutional Court, the law that now exists there is one of the demands of one of the orders that the Judicial Court gave to the, in this case, the legislative branch of the government. So it's something very similar happened in El Salvador. In Mexico, it wasn't the same thing, but also we did have some achievements through strategic litigation and through cases that we as a civil society organization legally represented. In Mexico, just to give an example, in Mexico we have a system for attention to victims in general, victims of crime and victims of human rights violations. And the law that created this system, and there's a specific institution that runs this system, the law, I'm sorry for the noise, the law of this institution include, when it was created, it didn't include, but then they had a reform and included internal displacement as one of the vulnerable groups that they would have to attend, but it didn't define internal displacement. So this created an obstacle, because when an internally displaced person would try to get attention and try to get assistance from this institution, they would say, I don't have the capacity to determine if you are an internally displaced person or not. I don't know how I can say that, so I need, and if it was recognized as a crime in Mexico, they could have a document that they reported a crime, and then they could be registered and have assistance, but it isn't. Or they could have, because it's for victims, as I said, victims of crime and victims of human rights violations. So if they had a recommendation or some type of recognition from a human rights institution, they could also get this attention. But it's the process of being, there are hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons in Mexico, in the process to do a complaint with a human rights institution and then be recognized. Less than 1% of the cases get to do that. So even though it was recognized in the law, in practice, it was really difficult for internally displaced persons to be registered and to get assistance. So in one of the cases we represented, we included that in the litigation, because we represented a family that they couldn't get, they actually were registered, but as victims of crime, and that gave them the right to specific kinds of assistance, but they didn't get the comprehensive assistance that they would get and they needed as internally displaced persons. So one of the things we included in the litigation was that we had now a court order that says that this institution does have the capacity to determine if someone is internally displaced or not, and then if it is, to register and provide assistance. So just another example. So both cases that we talk about in the article are also examples of this.
Thank you very much.
Exactly, and again, encourage everyone who hasn't yet to check out the article. Maybe yeah, I'll just turn to back to this really compelling issue around politicization of internal displacement and the way that it's sort of treated differently at a global level and national level compared to the refugee situation. Maybe pass it over to Professor Cantor, who has had some interesting thoughts on this. Thanks so much.
Oh, many thanks. And it's interesting to read all the comments in the chat box and hear the discussion as it goes on and just pick up some of the themes that are coming out. The point made by Romola, of course, is a very good one, that the legal regimes relating to refugees and IDPs tend to be quite different. But I do think that there's actually a bit of a gap there that, you know, if you're writing a dissertation or doing some research at the moment, is quite interesting. And that is where you have refugees who are displaced, let's say across a border into a neighboring country where there's a conflict, in the Kivus, for example, in Congo, and then they end up being displaced within Congo as well. What kind of protections do you need in that sort of circumstance where you're dealing with those who are non-nationals, who face persecution in their own country, have a precarious position, but they're also subject to being forced out of their homes as well? So an interesting practical issue. But on the point of politicization, one of the areas which I didn't touch on, which I think your discussions brought out really nicely, is at least in the very early days, one might argue that there wasn't a great deal of attention to IDPs because they didn't really have any kind of policy or legal existence. You know, the refugee frameworks have been long established back, you know, to the 1920s at the international level, and obviously 1950 1951 Convention as, a cornerstone of the modern refugee regime. By contrast, of course, in the early 1990s, certainly, there's very little point of reference in international law or policy about this concept or the idea of internal displacement and internally displaced persons as having accentuated vulnerabilities. I think it's, the argument there might well have held that, the lack of interest was kind of a lack of law and policy that gave visibility to this issue at that time. But if you look today, I think you're faced with a rather different situation. As Romola's presentation in particular brought out, you have this guiding principles on internal displacement, which are reasonably well known and serve as a basis for action, at the very least in internal displacement situations all over the world. You also have international law now, 2 bodies of international law at least, 2 treaties, both of them in Africa, that deal with internal displacement. There is, if you like, a status of IDP in international law now, in the same way that there is for refugees. And of course, at the national level, you now also have a large number of countries, as Romola again mentioned in the study she did with Phil Orchard, that do have national laws and policies on internal displacement. So it's not that there's a lack of law or policy in this area. It's not that there aren't points of reference, conceptual, legal, policy-based, for research, for action on the issue. That's certainly a change. I mean, I think nowadays, as I've argued actually in a previous publication, there is, if you like, a body of IDP law and policy in the same way that there's a body of refugee law. So the politicization point is an interesting one when you sort of think about it in that regard. I'm not sure that the lack of law is something that leads to the lack of visibility. Are IDPs in a different situation politically to refugees? Well, to some extent. But let's not forget refugees are also highly contentious politically. I think nobody needs reminding of that point. They are, if you like, a political hot potato in absoluto. Yeah, they are non-nationals whom a government's expected to take responsibility for, a highly politically charged situation. Of course, internally displaced persons, the political issues are different. They are about, are you interfering in the domestic affairs of the country to which they belong? So I think when we talk about one being politicized and the other not, we need to be careful about that. They're politicized in some ways, in similar ways, and then there are also distinctions, but how those distinctions play out, what their implications might be in terms of longer term attention to the issue, I think we still struggle a little to understand that. Having said that, I must say that the articles on political will in the special issue helped me to start thinking about those issues. So I think I'll leave it there. Mark, back to you.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and it's also a good time to point out that Professor Kanner is not only the editor-in-chief of Refugee Survey Quarterly, but contributed an article on this exact topic that's in the special issue. So thanks so much for your thoughts on that. We're gonna wrap up shortly before I hand it over to the head of the Secretariat for the high-level panel, Mr. George Okoth-Obo. But first, I wanted to bring in Dr. Hudson for thoughts on this issue, and again, the kind of thing I teased at the beginning around, there's indications in your article around the need for some kind of home or platform for state-to-state engagement, but interested to hear a bit more about what kind of parameters or form that might take. Thanks so much.
That's a really good question. My gut instinct is to deflect the question in a little way, in the sense of then saying, well, in terms of giving those sorts of concrete answers, I think that's part of the point of this whole event, is that we need to do more comprehensive research into questions such as this. Specific internal displacement research, rather than just any sort of assumption that existing platforms, existing places for debate will be suited to the internal displacement context. I do think that, I mentioned a couple of these points towards the end of my presentation, I think there is some important, I guess, key principles that we could follow, or good sort of things to aspire to. So for instance, a more multi-layered approach. I think looking at fora as just one international fora where everything to do with internal displacement could be sufficiently discussed and everyone would be happy to reveal their thoughts on it is somewhat idealistic and perhaps naive, and also perhaps not the right place anyway. Part of the reason, of course, why there's little discussion on internal displacement in the Universal Periodic Review is because there is a whole host of other things that also demand attention during such a forum, which involves all states. So I think we need to learn from the regional and we need to learn from the more local, but I don't think we want to do that at the expense of nonetheless having some sort of international framework. And that's kind of what I mean, I guess, by multi-layered, in the sense that, you know, there's no reason why we couldn't have more regional gatherings, more regional places for discussion, as we see in, for instance, the displacement dialogues, and we see very much so in the GP20, which is of course continuing now further. That we have those more regularly, but then we have a touch point, perhaps an annual, biannual touch point where we can all come together at that international level. But I don't think it's wise to just hook all of our hopes on one forum, one design, in that way.
No, it's really insightful, and I think nuancing it like that is quite critical. So thanks very much. Just before I hand it over to my current boss, Mr. George Okoth-Obo, there was a question in the chat box around whether it was still possible for NGOs and others to send contributions to the high-level panel, and absolutely. Between now and June, July is critical for the panel's work. Any ideas, informal or formal, on these and other issues, happy to receive. The emails for myself and my colleague Greta are in the introduction of the to the special issues. So feel free to reach out to us. The panel is always open and ready to hear new, interesting, creative ideas. So don't hold back. And with that, I just want to really greatly appreciate the work of all those who contributed to the special issue, the presenters at today's event, all of you for listening and participating. Give a special acknowledgement to former intern Leah Zamor, who did a lot of work on this last semester when she was with us. So thank you, Leah. And with that, I just want to again appreciate all of the speakers today, Dr. Hudson, Dr. Adiola, and Dr. Magalhães. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Assistant Secretary General George Okoth-Obo, who is the head of the Secretariat of the High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement. So over to you, George. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good morning. I hope you can hear me, Mark.
Yeah, we can hear you well. Thanks.
Yes, I was just saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending on your geographical location right now. As Mark said, or rather highlighted at the beginning of the event in his remarks, the thematic areas that are the subject of this special issue, I think, Mark, you grouped them at about 7 items. These are pretty much the agenda of the high-level panel itself, all the way from political will to the place of normative policy, all the way through to the nexuses. These are the very questions that the panel is itself exploring and will make its recommendations upon. So my task here today really is a very simple one. It is to thank most honestly all the, I think there are up to 22 researchers who wrote the papers and published them. And of course, in particular to, for today's event, the 3 who have presented their thoughts in the publication. I also want to, in a very special way, Professor David Cantor, really to thank you very personally. and in an extremely warm way for having brought up the idea of this special issue and for collaborating with us, particularly my colleagues, Mark, Greta, and you had a shout out to Leah as well for the special issue not only having come out, but exactly on time. So I really, really want to thank you very warmly for that. For 3 months, the publications are available for free, are online, which you cannot really underestimate this, the importance of this, because I think that contributes to the visibility that the panel is also trying to generate ideas on, that people can access the documents and be able to read them. I need to tell you that I've read all of them by now, and they really, I think, should be very helpful and productive. To conclude, I am certain that the panel will make a recommendation for the establishment of a research, intellectual production, ideas propagation engine for internally displaced persons. Now, whether that would be a distinctive engine or one that would associate with others that exist, research institutions, and association by subjects such as refugees, migration, I think is to be seen. But certainly if the Secretariat has its way in terms of catalyzing some of the work of the panel, there will be a recommendation along these lines. So the collaboration that all of you have already now with this initiative will not end with the publication. I think looking forward to that time where there is a platform to propagate more systematically and predictably on the internal displacement issue. I think your role, your leaning into this issue will continue to be very important. But for now, just allow me to conclude by really thanking you again most sincerely for the great work that you have done already. It is already and will continue to be very, very productive in at least informing the work of the panel, if not drawing out directly from it towards some of its conclusions and recommendations. Thank you again very much to all of you, and particularly to you, David, for having brought all this together.
Thank you, George. And with that, we'll just pass it over to Professor Cantor to close us out. Thank you.
Right. Well, first of all, many thanks, George, for your insightful comments and also, of course, for the kind words. And to Mark for your skillful moderation of the discussion that we've just heard, sparked by your special issue. In closing, I'd like to use the final 2-3 minutes to share some of the work being done at the Internal Displacement Research Programme, the IDRP, which is an academic centre initiated at the University of London just last year to promote, support and disseminate research in this field. A sample of the many activities carried out by the IDRP can be seen on the screen now. Rather than reading them all out, instead I'd like to highlight a few potential points of interest, whilst you can scan the slide at your leisure, and of course the slides will be shared in the chat if you'd like to look afterwards. Firstly, the IDRP is located at the Refugee Law Initiative, but it's important to emphasise that its approach is interdisciplinary, reflecting the wide range of different implications that internal displacement has across many varied disciplinary debates. You'll see that this is also evident in the wide range of disciplinary backgrounds of our IDRP research affiliates and senior associates, whose profiles I'd encourage you to browse on the website. Secondly, although the IDRP and its membership conducts research on a range of themes, a key strand of its work involves supporting and promoting research on internal displacement by others. As one example of this, I'd like to highlight the opportunities for both established and budding researchers, as well as policy actors, to get involved with the regional research networks on internal displacement that we support in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, with, of course, financial help from the UK Global Challenges Research Fund. Membership of these regional research networks, which is free, gives you access to online training programs and events on internal displacement and offers a variety of opportunities to develop contacts, collaborations, and projects within these research communities and with a range of really great researchers in each region. If this appeals to you and you're a researcher or policy intervener, please send me a CV and a covering email outlining your interest, and I'll forward it to the relevant network lead. Finally, as part of this effort to build up a stronger research community, the IDRP aims to facilitate the publication of research on IDPs. Have a look at the RLI book series, the articles in the IDRP Working Papers series, and consider submitting a piece to the new blog series that we're going to set up this month on internal displacement. Of course, talk about publication inevitably brings us back full circle to the Refugee Survey Quarterly, which, under my editorship, very much welcomes submissions, not only on refugee issues, but also on internal displacement. Next slide, please. Indeed, the special issue on improving attention to internal displacement globally that we launched today is a great example of the kind of high quality and high impact research that can be created by these sorts of collaborations. I'd like to end here by formally launching the special issue and, again, congratulating every single one of the contributing editors, authors, and reviewers for this outstanding piece of work. Lastly, many thanks to you all who tuned in today for participating in this discussion. I really hope it spurred your curiosity for further researching and engaging with the phenomenon of internal displacement. Good evening.